What's up, everybody? Welcome back to Facts on the Ground. I'm Misty Winston, and I am joined by my co-host, Jesse Zerwell. Today, we are welcoming the managing editor of Shadowproof. He also hosts Unauthorized Disclosures with Rania Kalick and Dissenter Weekly, which is his weekly podcast about all things whistleblowers and all of that good stuff. So Kevin Gosztola, thank you so much for joining us on the show.
Yeah, I'm glad to be with you.
Yeah, of course. So we wanted to have you on because whistleblower Daniel Hale is facing his sentencing hearing on Tuesday. He's the drone program whistleblower. And so we were trying to get him a lot more coverage. People, I mean, as you know, you're one of few people who cover these things on a regular basis. And Daniel Hale has just really kind of been forgotten in the mix of everything. So maybe we could start with you just giving us like kind of a brief rundown of who Daniel Hale is and what he exposed with his whistleblowing.
Daniel Hale is an Air Force veteran. He was deployed to Afghanistan, where he was part of the U.S. military's drone program. Again, there's two programs. There's a CIA drone program. There's a military drone program. He was part of the one that isn't as secret and as closely guarded, but they both are involved in targeted assassinations. And he was involved in doing the kind of geolocating of people's cell phones, of target cell phones and other electronic devices that is useful and necessary in order for those killer drones to carry out their attacks. And then he returned to the US. This is around 2013, 2014. He's no longer in the US military, but he takes a job with a contractor called Leidos, and Leidos assigns him to the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency, where he works. And it's largely mundane. It's mostly on like mapping. He even says that to an extent, he was putting things on a map that were already done by Google Maps. So there's like really no reason to the work was kind of redundant in a sense. But he was involved in doing that work, and that was how he had access to the classified information databases that contained the documents that had all these details. And so as he was dealing with his conscience, which we can get more into, he had access to these files on the watch list, how people are placed on terrorism watch lists. This relates to the no-fly list as well. Muslim Americans finding out that they are on the no-fly list. He had information about how people were being placed. And then there are documents about the way war is being pursued in Afghanistan and other countries. He has access to information on small footprint operations, as they're called, that are taking place in the continent of Africa. And he has all these documents that he's able to get to in order to expose the U.S. drone program.
Oh, you
froze up. Do something to improve my connection.
Yeah, you froze up a little bit.
Yeah, hold on a second.
Okay.
Sure.
He really froze that time. My hair is fading really fast, dude. I don't like it.
Until it stabilizes. Are we back?
Yeah, you're back. Yep.
All right. So he has access to all these documents, and all of the documents basically at his fingertips. He decides to reach out to Jeremy Scahill, whom he knows is working on all of the drone warfare that is carried out by the United States, investigating. At this time, Jeremy had already done the work on Dirty Wars and publishing that project and releasing that documentary. And so he passes it on and makes possible another project that Jeremy Scahill spearheaded at The Intercept called The Drone Papers. And he ghostwrites a chapter and says he's the source, who talks about why he disclosed the files for this book. And this contains information related to the way that people are targeted as part of the targeted assassination complex. And essentially, he is interviewed by Sonia Kennebec, who does this documentary called National Bird, and he's out there. And if people see, I'd imagine a good portion of the public were introduced to Daniel Hale in the past week or two because of the New York Magazine story that was done by Carrie Howley. It's excellent, and Daniel Hale sought out this reporter in order to get his side of the story before the public prior to his sentencing. And so there was a lot of really good information in there about what what went into his decision to blow the whistle and everything. So I got a little lost in my answer here. He went to, this is what I wanted to say. In that story, there's mention that Glenn Greenwald says something to Snowden about a source. He's talking about Daniel Hale in Citizen 4 when he whispers to Edward Snowden, and then Edward Snowden says, well, I hope that source is taking good care of themselves and blah, 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 because it's really risky. And then at the end of the film, Jeremy Scahill mentions that there's, a whistleblower that is come to him. And so they're talking about Daniel Hale, and Daniel Hale is in this National Bird documentary. He's interviewed. I mention all of this just because, there is a profile for Daniel, even though his name's not out there. The U.S. government would already have been looking to try to figure out who this person was, and he was raided. So in the production of this film, in the film story, you actually see that Daniel Hale was raided by the FBI, and this is back in, I believe it's 2014, and so this happens, but there's no indictment that follows, and President Obama's still in office. But years pass, and nothing happens. He keeps waiting and waiting to see if he's going to be charged with any sort of a crime, presumably under the Espionage Act, having been advised. He was consulting and working with a very well-known representative of whistleblowers, Jesselyn Radick, who knows this stuff very well and has represented John Kiriakou and others. So he's getting advice about what could happen to him, but nothing happens. And then Donald Trump makes the decision, I think it's 2018, 2019, makes the decision to indict, and he's charged with 5 different counts, and they're all Espionage Act related offenses. And then that proceeds. And where we're at now has all been delayed. It was delayed by the pandemic. He was supposed to go on trial in March of 2020. So he's been waiting and waiting. He was out of prison, which is an important thing to add here in this long setup for our conversation. And he was not in jail until April, when essentially his therapist said something about his mental health that was construed by pretrial services and the court and the government as he might be, he might do harm to himself. We've got to protect him and ensure he gets to the sentencing date alive. So we're going to put him in the Alexandria Detention Center.
Sounds familiar.
Yeah.
And everyone knows how good prison is for your mental health. I mean, obviously.
It's an amazing place to go if you're struggling with how many people you were involved in shooting Hellfire missiles at.
Yes, it's like a really an oasis. Everybody needs to go there for a break if you're having trouble with your mental health.
Yeah,
so
it's like a Betty Ford rehab clinic.
Yeah.
I want to talk more about the indictment and also how these watch lists are drawn up, these target lists are drawn up, because this is not something that was non-existent before the drone program. It's been part of the so-called war on terror since the very beginning. But before we get into those two things, I'm wondering if you can give some background on who Daniel is as a person, how he ended up joining the military, because it wasn't as if he was some gung-ho jingoist. There were circumstances that sort of forced him to join the military and end up where he is right now.
Well, yes, so that's sort of outside the purview of what I've been focused on in covering the case. I'm not sure that I can say exactly why Daniel Hale specifically joined the Air Force.
He was homeless. I know that he was homeless and
Yeah.
like, was out of options, basically.
But other than to say that, like, I would presume it's for the same reason that so many people of the current generation and maybe the past generation have been joining to participate in these wars that are part of the global war on terrorism. It's because that's the only way they could imagine getting money to go to college. That's the only way they believe they're going to be able to begin their lives as adults, and that's been accepted as the main welfare program for young people if they do not have the ability to get started because they don't have a trust fund or some other thing available to help them get through college and not accrue hundreds of thousands of dollars in debt. And so I can imagine that, like Daniel represents a lot of different people there, and different from Chelsea Manning, because it's not so much that you join to prove yourself, to like prove something to people.
Right. That's the distinction I was trying to get at here.
Yeah,
just to give more context to whom he is.
Yeah, no, I mean, like, if you think about, because I see a lot of not necessarily like I don't want to force our entire comparison into this direction, but when I read his case, I see some things that remind me of Chelsea Manning, just because of that being such as like major and very like there's not a whole lot about her case that we don't know. So like whenever you hear about what happens to someone like Daniel Hale, or you hear about something that happens to any other whistleblower, it's almost immediate that you think of these like references.
Mm-hmm.
And I know that Chelsea had an abusive father who essentially wouldn't let her be herself, and she had all of these things that were going on with gender identity that led her to essentially enlist into the military so that she could somewhat, I believe, prove to her family that she could be a stable person and live a life. And things weren't connecting. She was jumping from job to job. I mean, the same might be fair to say with Daniel, that perhaps he sought the military for stability. But I don't believe he was doing it to like prove to anyone that he was, could be like a man, like could actually.
Right.
Yeah. Based on his own words, that's the story I've gotten so far.
But the homelessness, yeah, like there's a lot of people who enlist in the military.
I think that's why it's important to bring it up, because we do essentially have a poverty draft at this point. People aren't able to afford college. They aren't able to get jobs without college. And so, they find more and more people find themselves running to the military as just a source of income or healthcare or education. And I think that's something that really we need to address in this country. But yeah, maybe Jesse, did you want to jump into the indictment a little bit so that we can kind of get a feel for exactly the charges that he's looking at? Because what's interesting about this case, at least for me, is that he has 5 charges. He's currently pled guilty to 1, but they're refusing to dismiss the other 4. And maybe you could speak a little bit about why that is, and what the significance is of that.
Yeah. So you've got 5 different charges, and these are basically the standard charges that you get in an Espionage Act case. And something that the prosecutors do, which you'll hear defense attorneys speak about, is they'll say that the charges are duplicative, because when you read the one charge, it'll have the story that goes with that charge. Because like for every charge, they'll say what you did that they think makes you guilty of that offense. So to keep it in something basic, it's like if you steal a piece of clothing from a store, then like that's burglary. So in the indictment, they would say, what was the chain of event that happened where you took that item from the store? But like if there's a second or a third crime that happens in the while you are stealing, they might add that on, and then those two additional charges could also like describe the exact same thing you did, and then it almost is like you're being charged three different charges, but you only did one thing wrong. So the defense attorney will argue that you're being overcharged or it's duplicative charging. Like you could only charge me with burglary, but you can't also like charge me with like another crime or a second crime and like say like it was this, because it has to be that I did different things. So that's basically where we're at now, is that Daniel pled guilty to obtaining national defense information under the Espionage Act. And that just means that he pled guilty to the essentially almost everything that he's accused of doing. Basically everything that he's accused of doing, he accepted responsibility. As I said, I'm going to put those in air quotes, but those are important words to use because this is how you get to the phase where you can bargain down and get a lower sentence. So this is the game that we're playing. Like, it's really important for people to understand that when we use some of this language, we're not talking in ways that we would outside of the perverse punishment system that we have in the country. We're just using this language so that we can understand why Daniel is making certain choices that are going to help him get the least worst possible outcome. And so Daniel is accepting responsibility under one criminal charge. That's why that's what he did when he pled guilty on March 31st. He pled guilty to this one charge, but that left standing 4 other charges that were not dismissed. He was initially indicted for retention and transmission. So retention would be like he actually kept the information. Like, for example, it'd be like putting it on a hard drive and having it in your house. Causing the communication of national defense information. So that would be like emailing attached documents. That's what it could be. Or it could be like mailing it or whatever. Disclosure of classified communication. So that's like when he gave it to Jeremy Scahill. And then the theft of government property when he took those documents from the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency. And then there's obtaining national defense was the first one. But I mean, in a certain sense, that probably shouldn't be a crime just because he actually has access to that material. But I won't quibble with that. So there's 4 other, I'll stay focused because there's 4 other charges. What's happening with those charges? Those charges are just sitting there. And the prosecutors have decided to play a rather dirty game with Daniel Hale, where during the hearing that he pled guilty, they refused to dismiss these charges, even though Daniel Hale had just pled guilty to that one charge. So then the question was, do the prosecutors want to go to trial on those other charges and go after him separately and just, deal with that guilty plea later? And they said, no, we don't want to schedule a trial right now. We'll deal with what we would like to do after or at the sentencing hearing. So if they get, in my view, if they get the harshest possible sentence that they are seeking on July 27th, which is in 2 days after we recorded this, they are going to say, all right, well, we'll get rid of these charges because we're happy that he's going to go to prison for, I'll say what I think he's going to get, 7 years in prison. So we're happy he's going to be issued the 7-year sentence in prison. And so let's get rid of these charges. We'll be done with this case. There's no more business that we have before this court against Daniel Hale. We'll accept this as the outcome. But if the judge, for some reason, recognizes certain aspects of Daniel's character, there have been letters of support filed. Daniel just wrote a letter. We can read some stuff from that letter before we're done, if you want. There are groups like the Reporters Committee for Freedom of the Press and the Council, the Islamic Relations CARE wrote this, is filing this brief about how the documents on the watch list helped clients of theirs when they were pursuing these cases to get people off the no-fly list. They're saying that Daniel Hale released the watch listing criteria and that helped them. So if any of that gets factored into a shorter sentence and they say, oh, well, 4 years, 5 years, that's not good enough, then they could go to trial and try to get him on these charges that have yet to be dismissed.
Yeah,
so
they're hanging it over his head, essentially.
Yeah. So right now, the sentence that he's seeking, that the prosecutors are seeking, is all for just one single charge, which we know what the prosecutors are seeking. They actually want 9 years in prison, but if he is willing to say that the release of his documents could have risked, if he agrees that they risked serious or exceptionally grave damage, then they are willing to take it down to 7 years and 3 months. And so they're playing this game. And again, that's also part of the game. Part of the game is saying that when he pled guilty, he hasn't done enough to grovel and beg, and that part of his guilty plea does not recognize the damage to national security that he risked. And even though he is agreeing to all of this in this political prosecution.
And I think it's important too to mention that this is, you have a piece out from a few days ago where the title is "The U.S. Government Seeks Harshest Sentence Ever in Leak Case Against Drone Whistleblower." And I think that that's something that's important to mention because Reality Winner was also the harshest sentence that they sought after. And so it seems like this attack on whistleblowers is just steadily increasing. And Biden administration and everything, everybody thought that maybe the Biden administration would be slightly less ridiculous about it than Trump was. And it seems that that's very much not the case.
Yeah, it's cumulative. So I know Jesse wants to get to another aspect of this, but just
okay,
to say
take your time.
That it stacks on top of each other. So Reality's the extreme. Reality gets the harshest sentence, and now the prosecutors are telling the court that that's actually normal. That was the reasonable sentence. And if you read their argument, and I describe it in the post that I put up at thedissenter.org, it shows that they're saying, well, we realize that Jeffrey Sterling, a CIA whistleblower, only got 42 months when he went to trial, and that was on several charges. And then there's John Kiriakou, CIA whistleblower, who had a case before the same court that Daniel Hale's before. This is in the Eastern District of Virginia, this notorious court. I know you guys talk about and cover Julian Assange's case, and so everyone would know that
unbiased community.
Everyone would know that this is the most favorable place for the national security state to have cases come through, and so So all of these, you basically these prosecutors are saying that people who are charged with the Espionage Act violations should be getting sentences that are in the higher range. The most you can get for a single violation of the Espionage Act is 10 years, but they're looking at all the different factors and they're saying that a person should get close to that amount. I mean, and it's never been, this on average, most people accused with leaks up until now, you can go through their cases and see, even the ones that we don't know that are more unknown, who maybe aren't quite whistleblowers, but are actually closer to leakers because they're not releasing the information to reporters because they care about issues, but they have more of a I hesitate to use the word agenda, but I think you know what I'm getting at.
Yeah.
They're exploiting a reporter in order to share information but they're not exposing, I guess what I'm saying is they're not really exposing corruption. There's just something
a story they want told.
Yeah. There's something they have access to and they feel like they can get away with releasing information to a reporter. So they do. And those people get maybe 1 to 2 years, it's so Daniel Hale and what he discloses, they want to put him in prison for 9 years. Meanwhile, you have these other cases where it's been much less. And the prosecutors are saying, well, we can't really say why courts have made mistakes like this before in the past. All we can tell you is we think this is the appropriate sentence now.
Right. And just going back to what I mentioned earlier, perhaps we can talk, and we don't have to go into too much granular detail, but provide a little bit of background into what Daniel exposed about the drone program and what some of what he exposed consists of, because I think Americans in general still have only a very vague sense of what the drone program is, and a very vague sense of how atrocious, how criminal it's been since its implementation. And I think that has played a big part in why a lot of people aren't hearing about Daniel Hale's case until now and haven't stood up for him until now. And that's not a criticism. And I think any attention that can be brought to his case, any solidarity is good. But maybe I'm just making that connection, but I'm wondering if you see that too, and perhaps can get into a little bit of just how serious the crimes are that he exposed.
Yeah, well, let me tackle what he exposed first, and then we can come back to the second part, and maybe you'll have to refresh my memory on the second part of your question. But
Sure.
But basically, what Daniel Hale exposed was that at the time Barack Obama as president, he had this system of placing people on the watch list, and as was written by Jeremy Scahill and Brian Devereaux, who is a journalist at The Intercept, who put out some coverage of Daniel's letter to the court. It exposed that nearly half of the people on the U.S. government's widely shared database of terrorism suspects were actually not connected to any of the known terrorist groups, and that more than 40% of them that were described by the government actually had no recognized terrorist group affiliation. So you've got this watch listing system, but all these people being put on there. I assume they're in the pool of possible targets that Daniel is involved in seeking out. And it turns out that a lot of the things that have landed them on these lists, so in addition to being in the pool of likely being added to a kill list, this means that they can't travel. And so this is what the US government was doing. And Daniel was able to share that. There were details about operations in Somalia and Yemen. There were details about a special operations task force in East Africa and the Arabian Peninsula. And that includes the base that the US military has in Djibouti, and how there's basically a drone base there that was used to hunt down people that are alleged members of Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula and Al-Shabaab. So Al-Shabaab's in Somalia, Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula is Yemen. And this was going on, if you go back to the early 2010s, all this stuff we're talking about Yemen happens before Saudi Arabia's war that has led to horrific famine and all kinds of other devastation, set back Yemen even more. It was a really poor, extremely poor country. They're even worse now. But before that, we were basically had leader of Yemen was lying and covering up that the U.S. had drones that were being used in Yemen to go after alleged Al-Qaeda targets. So there's that. And then there's the fact that there was a British citizen named Bilal El-Brajawi who had his citizenship stripped by the UK government. And then the US proceeded, now that he was stateless, to kill him in a US drone strike in 2012. And that's a document that was released by Daniel Hale to Jeremy. So you have about 10 documents. Yeah, there's 10 documents that were released to, and well, he released more documents, but 10 of the documents were charged by the United States. And what I just described are what I think are in the documents that were charged to him based on some research that I did when he was indicted, looking at when the documents were uploaded and what they say the dates are for these. They don't tell you what they are because these documents are still classified, so they don't talk about the contents of these. And they maintain that all of this is still secret information that they are protecting, even though, it's like we can all read it now. It's all been written about and covered by this project.
Yeah, for sure. And I think that's and I think that people need to recognize that this, I think Jesse's second part of his question was, do you think that this is the reason why they're going after such a harsh sentence is because it exposes some of the most heinous crimes. I mean, this is essentially murder, state-sponsored murder. They're killing people,
If you ask the average American if they know who Anwar al-Awlaki was or his son Abdul Rahman, and that they were American citizens who were extrajudicially murdered by drone strikes, most Americans don't know that. And that, again, that vagueness, I think, has contributed to the lack of coverage in his case, the lack of solidarity. So I'm wondering if you can speak to that a little bit, if you see that connection.
Yeah. So first, I'll just say that this is why I do what I do with my dissenter newsletter, just because you can go media outlet by media outlet and criticize them for not covering, but I think that there is just simply a culture of not covering whistleblowers in the media. And it's kind of astounding that people don't just when you see coverage of a whistleblower case, people don't often straight up report on what that person did and give you the details and dig into it. They'll almost report on it in a way that outs them and their failings, because they'll start to recognize that they need to make sure their readers understand what the Espionage Act is, and they need to make sure that their readers know that the classification system works like this, and they need to go through all these very basic details that we all have seen a number of these cases now, that it shouldn't be that you have to keep refreshing people's memory. It's basically the reason why journalists and newspapers are writing in this way, where it seems like it's like whistleblower cases for beginners. It's like the reason they have to do that is because you're not covering it. And so you basically are sort of admitting that you're guilty, so because you're afraid that people aren't going to know or have a frame of reference for Daniel Hale's case, that essentially is suggesting that you failed as a journalist or a media outlet. Because if right now you are concerned that people aren't going to know what you're talking about, it's really too late, because he's going to be sentenced and put in prison. So people needed to know who he was, what he did, why he did, and how come it was important back when he was indicted by Donald Trump. And that's when they should have known. And we could argue that they should have known who he was back in when Jeremy was publishing the drone papers, but there wasn't any name attached and we didn't know the source. And so it's okay that there wasn't a focus on an individual, but at the very least, they should have known who he was by 2018 and or when he was indicted. And so as far as like the harshness, like, are they coming down because of what is exposed? I think that's certainly possible, because one thing people should understand is this kind of information is the kind of information that the US government has been fighting aggressively in courts to prevent people from getting access to lawfully.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean that in the way that like they would describe it, because Freedom of Information Act requests have been put in for these exact documents. These groups I talk about, CARE and Reporters Committee for Freedom of the Press, and other organizations that are involved in civil liberties and press freedom work, the ACLU, the Electronic Frontier Foundation, all kinds of other people. This is stuff that they do lawsuits in order to get access to. Like, when we're talking about how people might land on a no-fly list, there are groups that have been looking for this information so that they can prove that there are abuses going on by the government. And the fact that it takes someone to release this without permission just shows how broken everything is, because the system is, it actually, I don't know how many people know this, actually says in the executive order for classified information that you are not allowed to classify things for the purpose of preventing embarrassment or hiding things that are crimes or
excuse me.
This is what we're describing. Like, if a court says that this was illegal, then they've actually committed another gross act, which is to keep information from us that shows that our government was doing something that was wrong. So that's so then in addition to putting people on a no-fly list that should not be on a no-fly list, then the second thing becomes you were hiding that information from us. And so that's actually something that should be wrong too. There's no way to like hold people accountable for abusing the classification system, but it actually says that in the executive order that you're not supposed to do it. And so I think there's something to be said that the harshness of the sentence has to do with what is being exposed here, because certainly, and this is how they're going to pursue wars now. I mean, this is where we're at. So Daniel Hale threatens the military industrial complex and the status quo for pursuing wars. Essentially, that's what those documents reflect.
And let's remember, these are Obama's wars to a large extent, and now
Yes.
Biden is the president and picking up the mantle, continuing that status quo.
Yeah, and all of these wars get continued through the Trump administration. The continuity is staggering.
Yes.
You know, we could sit here and debate Obama's politics versus Trump's politics versus Biden's politics, but they all sit back and take a back seat to whatever the CIA or the Pentagon tells them they would like to do in targeting these individuals in these countries. We're not in any less wars, though, you know, there have been some admirable efforts to get us out of supporting Saudi Arabia's absolute atrocities in Yemen, and being completely involved in that. But not, I mean, we're winding down Afghanistan, but we all know that with the panic that is being built up around the Taliban, even though we know that this is what they've been doing in the country for the last 6 to 12 months, in spite of that, the foundation is just being laid for another 5 to 10 years of covert operations where they do the exact same thing that we have seen in Yemen, Somalia, Iraq, you name it. And this is going to be the kind of thing where we have special forces. They did it in Libya. This is going to be what they do. It's just not going to, no longer is there going to be a nation building operation. There's going to be small operations like what Daniel Hale exposed. And so the harshness could be that he's threatening their model for war. And they're not accepting that they shouldn't pursue these wars on behalf of empire anymore. They're just accepting that they shouldn't continue the occupation in Afghanistan. So for someone like Daniel, who was a veteran of this war, they're not actually ending this conflict or saying that they're going to abandon this conflict. There's still going to be CIA and contractors and other people who
It's
are
a rebranding. Essentially.
Yeah. And even if we found that 75% of U.S. forces collectively, including the security spooks and the contractors, even if we say that like 75% of those are no longer involved, then you still have the backing and funding and the arming of Afghan military forces to fight off these militant groups that have been empowered in the vacuum, which is again going to require sending in drones and giving them air support and just doing all kinds of things from air bases outside of Afghanistan, which is the reality. So all of so this is this is a very good way of addressing what Daniel Hale exposed and why it is so important, because it reflects the current state of how war is prosecuted.
And just today, a report came out indicating that, well, not indicating, stating, and these are words that come directly from the general who had CENTCOM, that the US will continue airstrikes against the Taliban, presumably even after the withdrawal, if the Taliban keep advancing and threatening the Afghan government in Kabul that's largely considered illegitimate by the Afghan people. And then late last week, we had Antony Blinken saying that if the government in Kabul is overrun by the Taliban, then Afghanistan will be looked to as a pariah state, meaning that possibly it won't be allowed any aid from the international community, as if the US speaks on behalf of the entire international community. So already we're seeing early signs, blatant
They're setting
signs,
the stage.
right? That, like you said, Misty, it's a rebranding, and the war is going to continue in
some
different
form
package.
or another. Yes, I think that's absolutely accurate. But I also think that something that is important that we touch on is how impossible it is for somebody like Daniel Hale to get a fair trial. Like we talked about the Eastern District of Virginia courts. This is a court that is in the belly of the beast. The entire population is either from a 3-letter agency or a family member of somebody who works for a 3-letter agency. And I think that a lot of people, I saw an interview with John Kiriakou, he was talking about Daniel Hale, and somebody, they asked him, why did he plead guilty? And John was like, listen, this is a very personal choice. You can either, plead guilty and just kind of, go with it, or you can, plead not guilty, but they're going to beat you down. They will bankrupt you. They will make your life hell. And it's, it's impossible for these people. There are no protections for whistleblowers. There are supposed to be, but there really are no protections for whistleblowers. And Daniel Hale recently wrote a very long, very hard to read letter about his situation and how he's feeling about it. And maybe you could talk a little bit about that. Maybe if you want to, if you have it in front of you, if you want to read a little bit, some pieces from it, because I think it's really telling, and it's really, it's a long letter. I think it's like 11 pages, but I highly recommend anybody to just go read it, because this is somebody really just kind of bearing his soul and telling you why he did the things that he did. Because in that court, you don't get to have, that kind of defense. You don't get to have, where you can say, this is why I did what I did. And I think that that's really unfortunate. And it's something that I think we need to grapple with as a country, that if somebody is courageous enough to expose these kinds of crimes, we need to ensure that they are able to have some semblance of fairness in their trial. And it's just not possible at this point.
Yeah. So these cases have totally removed the intent, as far as I can tell, from any sort of case. Anything that the U.S. prosecutors bring against these people, it's never a question that they have to prove that someone intended to harm the national security of the United States. And it's very convenient and it works out quite good for prosecutors that all they have to do is show that Daniel Hale, when he went through his training, signed a non-disclosure agreement, and because his name's there, and because he went through training and he was told all the things that are supposed to scare soldiers straight so that they don't disclose these documents, and a lot of those are lies, but he was told that, like, this kind of information, if it ends up in the hands of America's enemies, this is what they could do to us. And then he signed the line and he agreed not to disclose the information, and that's his knowledge. And then basically that is what incriminates him and makes him guilty. And that's how they are able to charge someone with violating the Espionage Act. And it's not even that, it's not much more complicated. It's actually quite simple. And for the most part, it doesn't take much for a prosecutor to do this case. I mean, they've got so much case law at this point and cases from the last 10 years to work with that they can just pull from those, and they can scare people like Daniel into pleading guilty before they even go to trial. So it's important what you're saying, and I'm glad that we're focusing on this, because Daniel Hale, this letter to me is a lot like what we saw with Chelsea Manning when she made her statement to the court. There's a very well-known moment in her court-martial where she speaks, and it's the first time that we get to hear from her since she was abused and tortured at Quantico, and since she went through all kinds of mistreatment since she was arrested, and she was deployed in Iraq. So she was brought to the United States from Iraq. So there's all sorts of things that she went through. It's the first time that we get to hear from her to talk about the way she was treated fully. And she details the different decisions that she made and why she chose the sets of documents. And it was really important for the public to hear those words. And that's kind of what's happening here, except we don't have Daniel's voice, but we have Daniel giving I think it's fair to say, unfiltered account of what went through his mind. He's not describing like Chelsea Manning, how he picked the different documents and what he knew about those documents and why he chose Jeremy Scahill. And it's not as meticulous and detailed as Chelsea Manning's, but we get a lot of insight into what Daniel Hale was thinking and the trauma that he went through being a part of the drone program, witnessing people who were targeted by US drones, and the breaking point, like the moment when he was, I can't take it anymore. I have to go do this. Essentially, the breaking point for him isn't witnessing the drone strikes, but those have a traumatic impact on him, but it's being a contractor for Lidos at the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency and finding that this person who was starting to be friendly to him and he thought could be a good colleague to work with, is suddenly one day, hey, come sit with me. We're going to watch archive footage of drone strikes. So now it's like being deployed again in Afghanistan. They're watching war porn, which, by the way, war porn is in Chelsea Manning's statement because that's how she describes the collateral murder video. And they're watching drone strike videos, and he just can't take it. And that's when he really feels he's gonna need to take some documents and give them to the public so people can see. And he no longer wants to be responsible for what's going on in his name. And I'll read from the end here. This is a full 12-page, 11 and a half page letter, and 10 and a half page letter. And if you really should read it all.
Where can people find it?
I've got it linked at the dissenter.org. People can go there.
Okay.
It's headlined under Daniel Hale pens letter for judge describing how he came to violate the Espionage Act. In quotes. Those were his words.
We'll link to that in the show notes for sure.
Yes.
And so what I'll read is the end, because this is where he really like brings it all home and tries to make an impact on this judge about what went on in his deployment. So I'll read this, and then, you know, if there's anything we want to discuss about what he has to say here, we can. But this really summarizes everything that he worked through in his letter. It says, Your Honor, the truest truism that I've come to understand about the nature of war is that war is trauma. I believe that any person either called upon or coerced to participate in war against their fellow man is promised to be exposed to some form of trauma. In that way, no soldier blessed to have returned home from war does so uninjured. The crux of PTSD is that it is a moral conundrum that afflicts invisible wounds on the psyche of a person made to burden the weight of experience after surviving a traumatic event. How PTSD manifests depends on the circumstances of the event. So how is the drone operator to process this? The victorious rifleman, unquestioningly remorseful, at least keeps his honor in that by having faced off against his enemy on the battlefield. The determined fighter pilot has the luxury of not having to witness the gruesome aftermath. But what possibly could I have done to cope with the undeniable cruelties that I perpetuated? My conscience, once held at bay, came roaring back to life. At first, I tried to ignore it, wishing instead that someone better placed than I should come along to take this cup from me. But this too was folly. Left to decide whether to act, I only could do that which I ought to do before God and my own conscience. The answer came to me that to stop the cycle of violence, I ought to sacrifice my own life and not that of another person. So I contacted an investigative reporter with whom I had an established prior relationship and told him that I had something the American people needed to know.
Yeah, I
And
don't
I
think
think
you
that
can
that's
get any
really,
clearer than that.
yeah, that's the quintessential piece of his letter, because I think that it really does speak to the kind of person he is. You know, I can't even begin to pretend to know what he was going through, but I think that this is, I mean, just like anecdotally, this is a kid who, I say kid like he's, you know, 12, but he, you know, after being charged with the Espionage Act, couldn't find work, finally found work as a dishwasher, and then was fired for trying to organize the staff and trying to unionize the staff. I mean, that's the level of character that we're dealing with here. And I think that that's, you know, very apparent when you read his letter. And that's why I really highly recommend that people go and read it, because I think that it really speaks to who he is as a person. But, you know, I can't imagine having that kind of knowledge and having to live with it daily, and trying to grapple with exposing it or staying silent and all of those things that he's dealing with. And I would like to think I'd be that courageous, but I'm not sure I would be.
If you watch the documentary National Bird, which Kevin mentioned earlier, you can see some of the trauma he's going through in that film. Not in real time, obviously, because it was filmed several years ago, but almost in real time. You can see him, for example, in his apartment, just even when he's silent, even when he's doing the most mundane things like folding his laundry, you can see that the gears are churning in his head, about the uncertainty of what he faces, about the horrors he's seen. And I recommend anybody who's listening or watching to watch that film. And there's a lot more than that example I just mentioned, but you do get a visual of what somebody like Daniel is going through, leading up to what we're talking about now.
Yeah. it's not very edgy, but I will say that National Bird's better than Dirty Wars. I'm gonna say that. I think putting those drone whistleblowers front and center, it's extraordinary, and
Yes.
there's good revelations that came through Dirty Wars, but hearing from people who were in the drone program and the impact on them, it's
He spoke at
very
the
Drone
Code
Summit.
Pink, the drone summit, I think in 2013, if I'm correct.
Yeah.
And listening to his speech, and there's a moment where there's people in the audience who are family members of victims or victims themselves of drone strikes, and there's a moment where he apologizes to them, and it gets me every time. Every time it makes me tear up because, I think that the drone program. I mean, I know that war is there's no humanization in war. Everybody, you don't see the human aspect of people when you're in a war. But I think the drone program really takes it that much farther away. I mean, it's, it's like a joystick. It's almost like a video game at that point. You don't have to, like he said in the letter, you're not face to face with your enemy. You don't have to see them. You don't have to see the aftermath. So it really is like this removal away from the atrocities that you're committing. And I think that that's a really dangerous aspect of the drone program and of drone warfare. And he speaks really well about that and about how that, once that realization hits you of the things that you've, been a part of, I think that that's probably really, and we talk to Danny Scherzen all the time, who's a retired Army major. He talks about the difficulties that he deals with in handling the knowledge that he was a part of so many horrible things. So I think that, it's just kind of across the board. That's something that you hear from these people that's, I can't imagine just dealing with the PTSD of being in a war and of, being in that environment, but then also to deal with the personal morality of knowing the things that you took part in is probably really heavy. Again, I can't pretend to speak on it or know what that's about. But just trying to look at it in an empathetic way, that I'm sure that that's a really difficult thing to handle.
And it's go ahead, Kevin.
No, I was just gonna say that it occurs to me, and this is actually not a realization that I've had before, but it basically what he's gone through in this case will mean that he can never heal.
Mm-hmm.
And the reason why he can never heal is because part of accepting whatever sentence he gets and connected to his guilty plea requires him to tell the US government and the judge that he will never talk about the contents of these documents with anybody, and he will never basically say anything to anyone. So that means people who are survivors of the drone program, people who are relatives of any of the people who were killed by drones in Afghanistan, if he gets out of prison, which I imagine he would, he's a young person, and he goes on a trip like a lot of vets do to atone for their involvement. This was been a standard since our participation in the Vietnam War, that so many vets would travel back to where they were stationed to speak to people and apologize. And
we see that in National Bird with the other whistleblower, a young woman who travels to, I believe, Afghanistan. I could be mistaken on that, but to atone to the family of.
And so how can you, when you go see that family, he can't talk about really what he knows that they should be able to know, because the government's going to be watching. And if he violates it, he could be hauled back before court, and they really could make his life hell. It's already hell, but they could return him to that hell. I mean, once he is out on probation and then he continues on, I mean, who no longer will be treated the way he is now, but they can always pull you back in. And that's the
look
fear.
what they did to Chelsea. They did.
Yeah, that's the fear. That's the fear that they can always pull you back in. It's the fear of like, why isn't, and I think it's something for people to really consider. And I know we're getting close to the end of our conversation. I'll just leave people with this fact that, you're never really done with being prosecuted. You know, there's always something that you're dealing with because they've destroyed your life.
Mm-hmm.
And there are ways that they can claim ownership over you forever and ever. And you hear that with people who are convicted felons who, you know, outside of these national security leak cases. But there's the bare fact is that forever and ever, you know, people like Daniel, Reality Winner, others, you know, not all of them are going to have the courage like John Kiriakou to keep speaking and say that, you know, I don't believe you're going to do anything to me. Thomas Drake doesn't believe anything, but the case against him fell apart. So it's sort of different. But, you know, Chelsea doesn't really speak on these topics too much. You know, she's very careful about what she says, and she's never talked about, you know, she never talked about giving these documents to WikiLeaks, and she's very careful about what she says on these topics. In fact, I think she'd rather speak about things like immigration and healthcare and policing, which weren't really even the subject matter of a lot of what she exposed. So that just shows you that, like, no matter what, there's always going to be this fear that something you do or say is going to give them a pretense to haul you back before a court and restart this cycle of well, I mean, it's trauma, but like, it's, you know, restart the cycle where they are able to
completely disrupt your life.
Yeah. And it's a form of psyops when you boil it down, to keep you psychologically and physically mute.
And what you just said, Kevin, is because I had never thought about that either, though. And what this really does mean is that these people there is no opportunity for healing. There's no real opportunity for them to, you know, work through these things in a healthy way. And they've always got this dark cloud hanging over them for the rest of their lives. And these are people who should be celebrated. Like, he shouldn't be facing sentencing on Tuesday. He should be, a statue should be unveiled, you know, of Daniel Hale in downtown Washington, D.C. or something. If we lived in a sane world, we would protect our truth tellers. And the people who committed the crimes would be in prison. And that's not the situation in which we find ourselves. So, I mean, that's a really unfortunate thing. And I think that's why we wanted to really get more coverage for Daniel Hale. We wanted to do more coverage for Daniel Hale, trying to drum up as much support for him as humanly possible. You know, these cases, other than yourself, which, you know, you do amazing work at Dissenter and at Shadowproof of covering whistleblowers and press freedom cases and all of that stuff, which I can't tell you how much I appreciate. I know I said that on the vigil the last time you were on, but I just want you to know that your work is appreciated and noticed, because there aren't a lot of people who are doing it in a real thorough way. You mentioned earlier that, you know, sometimes people will cover it, but it's usually very kind of surface level, or it's very, you know, here's the Espionage Act, let's do a history lesson, or, you know, those kinds of things. You really dig into these cases and you really focus on the individual and their history and their story and how this affects them. And I think that's really important.
Yeah. So everyone, there's not a lot to add to that, but every outlet pretty much recognizes when somebody gets indicted, it's news. When somebody goes to trial, it's news. Somebody's found guilty or not guilty, it's news. They go to prison, how long are they going to prison? It's news. But beyond that, and that actually leaves out a whole hell of a lot that, like, we just don't get, you know. And there's possibility that people follow those headlines and they're just still confused, and they're like, okay, why is he going to prison for 7 years? Wait, what did he do? And or they're just like, well, I guess it's, you know, he should have known it's against the law to release information. And and if that's the thought that you walk away with, then, you know, the U.S. government has one. Yes. Because we need to make people truly question the idea that, that's the rule. The rule is that you don't release the secret information. And if you do, you ought to know that you're asking for it. And it's just like, we've really got to get past that with people. So you can see that in many cases, if someone like Daniel Hale doesn't take this risk, it can be 25 or 30 years before we even know what, you know, some of this stuff And we know from, like, go look, if people don't believe me, go look for something called the National Security Archive and read through some of the documents that they do. It's a really good library. And they've got all this information about CIA involvement in coups in Latin America and stuff that is important. But we had to wait 25 years or longer to get that information. There was nobody like Daniel Hale who told us what happened in Chile, or there was nobody who stepped up to tell us what was happening in any of these countries. So, Daniel Hale and people like him who are doing this in real time, when this information isn't old, Chelsea Manning and Edward Snowden and them who take these risks tell us about information before it's like 2 or 3 generations old. Like those are real heroes who are saying that we don't need to be slaves to this classification system. We don't need to allow this to give powerful people cover so that they aren't held accountable. There's very little accountability. Listen, like, it's very amazing to me that they would freak out that we would know what they're up to, because even when we know what they're doing,
Nothing's
it's still
done.
damn near impossible to get them before a court to answer for the crimes that they've perpetrated. So it's even more incredible that we live in a country where not only is, let's say, for example, torture is decriminalized, ordering murders from the sky is decriminalized, but also they have a way to protect people from ever finding out that they were involved in torture or ordering these murders. And so that adds an extra layer, I think, to the like vileness and viciousness of all of this. Because truly, there is a kind of spitefulness to this case. It does really feel like,
Yes.
they won't accept anything less from Daniel than submission, and he actually hasn't. And this letter shows that he's gonna make sure he goes to prison with some of his dignity, and that gets under the skin of the U.S. government. So we all have to have his back.
Yes.
And if anybody wants to question what I'm saying because I'm supposed to be some kind of like fair and impartial journalist, I would just politely tell them that Daniel Hale is a source. And no matter what, every single journalist, no matter how they feel about any of these issues of war and peace, you should stand up for your sources, especially when they're prosecuted by the US government. You wouldn't let China prosecute sources for journalists. You wouldn't let Russia go after sources for journalists. So we certainly shouldn't let them go after sources in the United States who are providing us stories, and some of these that are award-winning and give us like so many accolades. It's wrong. It's wrong for people, whether they're at the New York Times or the Intercept or even small little outlets like Consortium News, to win awards or recognition without giving people the support that they need, the solidarity. I'm not suggesting that Consortium News did that, by the way.
No, just
Chris,
example.
I'm just saying that.
Chris
I'm just saying
Hedges
whatever size of the outlet, it doesn't matter. You have a duty to stand up for these people.
Yes.
I was just going to add on the Consortium News tip real quick that Chris Hedges recently published an excellent piece on Daniel Hale called, it's something like Bless the Traitors. I know that's wrong, but it's something close to that. And I recommend everybody check that out.
Well, Daniel told the New York Magazine reporter that he wanted to be called a traitor and not a whistleblower.
I like his style.
And that's fine.
Yeah.
I'm going to continue to call him a whistleblower just because, I do my thing and I think he fits in. But I understand that there's some people who don't want to be called whistleblowers because they feel like that puts like a target on their back. That's not Daniel. Daniel's way of thinking is that he's a traitor because he betrayed the U.S. war machine. And so he should be proud to be a traitor of the
But if we're
US
being
war
fair,
machine.
the US betrayed its value system. I mean, its proposed value system, what it claims to stand for, because we all know it doesn't. But I mean, to be fair, he really isn't a traitor to the US. The US is a traitor to all of us. The US military industrial complex is a traitor to all of us. So,
well, and the other reason I don't get sucked into that is just because this is kind of outside of the conversation about Daniel Hale. But when I covered Chelsea Manning, I always got very irritated by the way that media organizations would discuss her case, and they'd have these, but I thought were frivolous or meaningless debates of like, is Chelsea Manning a hero or a traitor? And I really felt like that was just a very lazy way of talking about her case, because there's just sort of was like, you don't know anything about what she did. And
that seems like a personal opinion thing, not a factual,
yeah.
This is what the facts of the case are. That seems
Right.
like, is she a hero or a traitor? It doesn't really matter what you think of her or Daniel Hale.
Personality analysis.
Yeah.
It is. Yeah. And it's like a personal value test. Like, I don't care about your purity test. I care about what the facts of the case are, and what they exposed and what the, all of those things. So you're right.
So Daniel can call himself whatever he wants. But unfortunately, I hope he's not disgusted to know that I'm putting whistleblower in the headline for him. But, I think I'm going to do that every chance I get, because I know that one of the things that upsets these federal prosecutors the most is when we think they're whistleblowers while they're trying to punish them. And you can hear that in court. You can see that in the things they write. It's no more frustrating to them, than the example that we've talked about John Kiriakou. I mean, there were, there's all the kinds of things they wrote about how they were fed up that he held himself out as a whistleblower. And so it's the same way they get fed up that people think Julian Assange is a journalist. So, these labels do actually matter.
They do.
Because that's what they are.
Changes public perception. Yeah, it really does.
So we shouldn't, they make it a battleground, and we should never just say, well, okay, whatever, we don't care. We're just going to talk about the case and pretend like it doesn't matter.
Right. And if we accept their language, their terms, then we accept their narrative by default. And that's
they get to define the story.
Complete opposite of what we want to do.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I know you have to go, Kevin. You've been very generous with your time. I appreciate you coming on to talk about this. We definitely wanted to get this out before Tuesday. So do you want to tell everybody where they can find your work? And I know that after Tuesday, you'll have an amazing piece ready to go. So everybody needs to make sure they're keeping up with, all the stuff that you're writing and all of your shows and everything. He's a very hardworking man, y'all. He's got a lot going on.
The thing I will say is I don't know if the public can do this or not, but if anybody wants to follow Daniel's sentencing hearing, it's possible that you might be able to call in and hear it, because of the fact that we haven't actually ended the pandemic yet. So I'm not sure that people are going to actually be in court, even though there's going to be a demonstration in support of Daniel, which is to say that I plan to be covering it remotely. I don't know that the public can actually call in. I'm pretty sure press can call in. I followed his guilty, when he pled guilty, I followed that by calling in. I'm based in Chicago. And so I plan to do that again. And any report that I post will be at the Dissenter, DISSENTER.org, thedissenter.org. That's a newsletter. You can subscribe. It's free. There's a paid part, but everything that's reporting and crucial and necessary for people to read is sent as free. And then I have a podcast that I do with Rania Khalek called Unauthorized Disclosure. And so, thank you for the chance to talk about this case.
Thank you.
And I presume you'll be talking about this after he's sentenced. So it's really good to keep his name out there.
Yes,
really
and we would
important.
love to have you back on, to get updates and things later on. And there will be other whistleblower cases, and I'm sure we'll need your opinion on and your coverage. So again, thank you
so.
for the work that you do. It's really important, and everybody should go and support Kevin. You can, shadowproof or at dissenter.org, whatever you can do to support independent journalists. We need it now more than ever. So thanks again for coming on the show. Everybody support Daniel Hale. I'm going to do everything that I can to, get the word out, and I hope everybody will join me. So yeah, thank you so much for coming on, and we will catch everybody next time.